Okay, this is a lecture that covers somewhat unrelated topics about writing, nominalization, parallels, and flow. And the ultimate goal here is not only to write a good sentence, but also to get the sentences to connect together and flow into a paragraph and make that paragraph a good one. And so as the title implied and listed, we're going to be talking about three things. As I said, they're mostly unrelated. Nominalization is somewhat related to the topic very much related to the topic we've already talked about. It picked on in the papers that we've been reading, that is buried verbs. So let's get into that. Before we do that, I want to remind you of this observation or recommendation from our textbook, Strunk and White, and they say that you should focus first on the verb and then the noun when you're thinking about the sentence. Right, with nouns and verbs, not with adjectives and adverbs. And it's those nouns and verbs that will make a good sentence. That's not the only key to writing a good paragraph, but that's a good start. So this book I'm going to use for much of this lecture, or for the next part at least, some observations, examples from Williams et al., or just Williams, and it uses this term nominalization that, as I said, is somewhat related to buried verbs, but in some ways it's more broad than that. And nominalization basically is, as it is with the buried verbs, is changing the verb into a noun. But actually, nominalization is more broad than that. It can change even an adjective, say lowly, into a noun, the lowly. Or, as with the buried verbs, it changes a verb, in this case legalize, into the noun legalization. It can also do that with a whole clause, as in he drinks to his drinking, and I am worried about his drinking, versus I am worried that he drinks. So, so some examples of changing an adjective to a noun are here: careless, carelessness, difficult, difficulty, and so on. And then also the verb is somewhat like what we've been talking about, very much like we've been talking about with regard to buried verbs. Discover is the verb, the discovery is a noun, move, movement, and so on. So the exercise then is to, or the key then is to get rid of these and to result gives a better sense, a more vigorous sense. A need exists for greater candidate selection efficiency. So what's happening here, as I've tried to say right there, is that in these examples here, what's being talked about is that the action exists, as opposed to just saying it straightforward, that is expressing the action. So rather than a need exists for greater candidate selection efficiency, we must select. There is a possibility of prior approval of it. He may approve of it ahead of time. And here's an example where, and I've pointed this out before, is to watch out for using there is. It often leads to a flabbier sentence. Now, there are times when there is perhaps a better way to go. For example, maybe we don't want to have he. Maybe we don't know the gender of the person who's doing the action. But generally, you should look at those sentences that you begin with there is or there are, things like that. There has been varieties of sentences that begin with there. We conducted an investigation of it. We investigated. A review was done. They reviewed. So in each of these cases, it's the hidden verb here. The verb is actually expressed as a noun, and it's just stating that something's happening as opposed to just saying it happened. And the other thing to note here is that all of these sentences here are much shorter. Well, maybe not much shorter, but certainly shorter than these sentences here on the left. So we've done two things. We've gotten rid of the buried verb. We have a stronger verb, and we have a more concise sentence. Now, shorter sentences are not necessarily always the better sentence, but a more concise sentence that says, gets across what you're trying to say with fewer words, that's the better sentence. There are times we'll see later that we want to add words to allow the reader to follow our train of thought and to make explicit ideas that are just needed to be said to make sure that the reader can follow what's going on in the paragraph. So sometimes the nominalizations are not quite as obvious as what we just saw, and that is the word looks exactly the same, but in fact one's a noun and one's a verb. And so request and review are examples of that, and return actually. In all three cases here, this is the noun. These are all nouns here. We request that on your return, I'm surprised it didn't say upon your return, pretty pompous way of saying it, you conduct a review. So again, talking about the existence of the action as opposed to just saying what the action is all about, and provide an immediate report. The better way is, of course, here we request that when you return, you review the data and report immediately. So again, a shorter sentence, more concise, gets the same ideas across much more vigorously than the first version. Okay, here's some other ones. So often the nominalization kind of, again, has to use a, maybe weak verb is a little bit extreme. I'm not sure conducted is that bad of a word, but you can see here the verb doing all the work is hidden there in the investigation. So the police conducted an investigation into the matter. Not that bad of a sentence, but if you have lots of those, that's not good. Much more vigorous way, shorter way, more concise way. The police investigated the matter. The committee has no expectation that it will meet the deadline. Again, not too bad, but more words needed to say just the committee does not expect to meet the deadline. And again, watch out for those sentences that start with there is or there are. So that often is a sign that that something has to be done. Now, the trick here though is you have to know what's going on, right? And if we look at this example here, there's a need for further study of this program. We have to know who's doing the study, right? We have to know that the engineering staff must study this program further. And so again, perhaps there are times where there is or there are is the way to go. But if you know who's doing the studying in this case, just say it's the engineering staff must study the program further. Likewise, well, in this case, I think it's real clear that you can get rid of the there was. There was considerable erosion of the land from the floods. It's clear that floods are doing the erosion, and all the words that are necessary are there. The information is all there. It's just getting rid of the there was to give a more vigorous sense. The floods can considerably erode the land. Considerably, not quite sure I like that, but that's a different problem. We won't dwell on that now. So, but again, we have the noun erosion, and we've changed it out for the more vigorous eroded. Okay, so again, another example of changing the subject so that you can use a better verb, a more vigorous verb. So the subject of this sentence here is intention, right? The intention of the IRS is to audit the records of the program. But it's clear who's doing the auditing, kind of apropos for tax season these days. Taxes are due April 15th. I'm not sure if you guys have to do any taxes, but I have to. I got them done already, happy to say. Anyway, the IRS intends to audit the records of the program. So our discussion concerned a tax cut. Again, empty verb, yeah, maybe, but I think it's clear that we discuss a tax cut is much more vigorous way of expressing that same idea. Again, notice that in both cases, these are fewer words, more concise, and there's no loss of information. That's a thing to recognize here. Okay, and so sometimes it's not really clear what the subject is. And this is a case where you will have to know something about what's going on to come up with the proper revision. So there has been an affirmative decision for program termination. Now that kind of reeks of something to get rid of the affirmative determination, affirmative decision and program determination. And here again we come up with there has been sentence. And we have to know who's doing the deciding, and terminating the program. And so in this case, it's the director decided to terminate the program. Again, much more concise way of saying what's expressed here. If we didn't know who was doing the terminating, I think we'd have to figure out some other solution for this sentence here. There has to be a way of getting rid of affirmative decision and program termination. I haven't figured out a way to do that without saying it's the director that's doing it. But I hope you get the idea that when you see these sentences that begin with there was, there is, and so on, take a look at them and see if there's a way to get rid of those words. Okay, here's a couple using were made that just really drives me bonkers, and have been used in other it's used often in science writing, and I just don't see the need for it at all. Measurements of SWC in each study were made in vertical axis tubes. I hope you can see how to get rid of that. Simply was measured. I don't see the measurements were made. Why that's necessary at all. I don't know what SWC is. Not really important here, of course. Similarly, this is often said, we made measurements. What the heck? Why do we need to say that? Why not just say we measured? So again, measurements is the noun, measured is a verb. Here, measurements again is the noun. Now we're using measured as the verb. Okay, so a little bit of an interlude. We don't use pronouns very much in formal technical writing in science, but it's a related problem with they and it that are used. So, but in case of pronouns, guilt, vengeance, and bitterness can be emotionally destructive to you and your children. You must get rid of them. I think they're not talking about the children. After Governor Baldwin watched the line perform, he was taken to Main Street and fed 25 pounds of raw meat in front of the Cross Keys Theater. I hope the governor was hungry and liked raw meat. The driver had a narrow escape as a broken board penetrated his cabin and just missed his head. This had to be removed before he could be released. So here's an example of this. Often this came up in some of your writing in the essay, your long essay, that some of you use this, and you have to be careful that it's clear about what this is referring to. It won't be as funny in your writing when it's not clear about what it refers to, but it can be just as confusing. My mother wants to have the dog's tail operated on again, and if it doesn't heal this time, she'll have to be put away. Not a good thing to say today because it's my mom's birthday, but well, anyway, you get the point here. What's going on, or what's not going on? That is what it's not clear what she'll have to be put away. Okay, but more seriously, think about and make sure that it's clear when you use they, it, this, so on. It's clear what's being referred to. Okay, now we're going to spend a few minutes on another topic, parallel structure. And by parallel structure, first of all, you need to have it. If you start a series of phrases that seem to be parallel, you have to keep that parallelism going on. So in this case, I love swimming, jogging, and sex. So we've started a parallel structure here with swimming and jogging. That's the present participle for those verbs. And we have to do something about this last word here, action. A couple different solutions. One is go this way. I'll let you fill in what the XXS X means. So that would make it a parallel structure. Another way, more dramatic way, would be to change it into the infinitive. That is, I love to swim, to jog, and to XXX. So here we got the parallel structure. Here is not parallel. Someone along the same line, this came from a paper I just read by two authors I really respect. They are been writing papers for a long time, and yet they have this pretty basic mistake. So they say draining humans after coastline habitats by it's misspelled there. Alter coastline habitats by building levees, draining land, channelizing rivers, damming rivers, and groundwater withdrawal. See where the parallel is built up and then it falls down at the last here. So we have building, again, the present participle, draining, channelizing, damming, and then we're expecting to see another something about maybe withdrawing groundwater. That doesn't quite work, but I haven't figured out what the solution is. Maybe it's more extreme than just putting some other word here. But the point is that here's an example where parallel structure is not followed. There isn't parallel structure. Now sometimes it's not quite as obvious as that, where there's parallel structure, but it's the same problem basically. He is a man of large ideas and having firm principles. So there's not three phrases as we've been seeing here, or two or three, but this is kind of should clang that that there's something not quite right about this. And here, this is a pretty easy solution. He is a man of large ideas and firm principles. And once again, solving one problem, that is getting rid of the having and having more of a parallel structure here, that solves the parallel structure problem, but also solves the problem of making this already pretty short sentence more concise. The having is not necessary. So the homework that's due at the end of Tuesday, when perhaps you're listening to this lecture, we'll have more exercises for you to get rid of the or change it to give a parallel structure to the sentences. So you'll have more practice at that. So the last topic we're going to be dealing with is kind of a couple different ones about getting ideas to flow within a paragraph. And we'll start again with your textbook, and where they say that you should put the emphatic words at the end of the sentence. By emphatic, I mean the new stuff, the stuff that you want the reader to remember, at least from that sentence. So here's one example. High chlorophyll at 30 meters was observed. So the news here is that the chlorophyll is high. And so everything's going in front, not where it should be. Now, having said that, there are times when new information is most effectively put in front of the sentence as a subject, but often it's not the case, and more often it's best to put that at the end of the sentence. And so the solution here is simply chlorophyll was high at 30 meters. That's the new part. And it gets rid of, notice my change gets rid of was observed, the passive. Okay, so Williams takes that idea a bit further and talks about these two complementary principles of cohesion. And it's basically you put things where readers are familiar with, where they expect to see them. So you start off with things that you've already mentioned, referred to or implied, and that so your reader's starting off on is not being surprised. And then you move into the things that are new, the emphatic words, to use Drunken White's term. And then that's where you kind of lead in the reader to what you want them to remember about that particular sentence. So let's look at some examples. So here's an example of two sentences, pretty short ones. Yersinia contains several species. The cause of bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, is one species, Y. pestis. Okay, so very short little paragraph. You perhaps take a little time to figure out, and it's because you're given this fact about it contains several species, and then you're given another new fact about bubonic plague, and then you're back to talking about this genus of bacteria, one of which causes the plague. So compare that to this, to the version. Yersinia contains several species. One species, Y. pestis, is the cause of bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. So this works, right? This works much better than this. And if you think, well, so what's happened, you're going from A to B, to something new, B, and then, I'm not going to try to diagram this out. I'll diagram it out in another, well, maybe the way to do it, no, I won't try to diagram it out. I do that later for another example. But the point here is that you've introduced a new idea early in that second sentence, whereas you want to put that new idea at the end of that second sentence. So hope you can see that this works much better. This doesn't work as well. Even though each of these sentences is fine, right? It's just that when put together, this is the way to go. Okay, so Williams he lists actually 4 techniques to get their emphasis in the right place, and I'm gonna just go through 3 of them. I don't quite get the 4th one. I don't know it. I don't see it as easily as these 3, so I'll just drop that, and you'll be happy to know that we're going to be talking about only 3 of them. I think they're pretty clear and obvious, and hopefully you can apply to your writing. In some ways, this is the hardest one, and that is to get rid of things, and that is to get rid of the stuff at the end that doesn't really need to be there, and so it highlights what you want to highlight and emphasize. So if you think about what's most important about this sentence, sociologists are making the provocative claim that our genes largely determine our social behavior in the way that we act in situations we find ourselves every day. Okay, so what's the most important part? I would say this part, right? That this is actually an argument that was started back by E.O. Wilson, who's an evolution biologist. Usually works just on ants, but he wrote this very controversial book about sociobiology, where he kind of applied the things he learned from ants to humans, in very provocative claims, as indicated here. But anyway, so that's the the take-home message, right? That makes you sit up and wonder that our genes are largely determining our social behavior. I have to say that it's been pretty much debunked. Now, certainly genes have a lot to do with how we behave, but to make some direct one-to-one correlation between the two, that just can't be done. It's even hard to do with things that seem to be fairly clear-cut: skin color, hair color, eye color. Those are controlled by many genes. There's like tens and tens of genes involved in each of those, what seem to be fairly simple physical traits of humans. So to think about having this correspondence between genes and social behavior, that's pretty far-fetched. Anyway, back to the writing. So how do we change a sentence to make it put the emphasis in the right place at the end? Well, we just drop the stuff that doesn't seem to be as necessary. Now, this may seem pretty extreme to you because you're getting rid of all this stuff that, well, maybe you think that should be in there somehow. I think one less drastic solution would be to say determine our social behavior and just get rid of in situations we find ourselves around us, and just say in the way we act every day. That would be a little bit closer to having the most important stuff at the end, a little bit closer to the end at least. So there's a less drastic solution to just dropping this whole thing off. But I hope you get the idea that that's one way to do it. It's just to lop off stuff that just doesn't seem to be as important. And that's always the key, and it's sometimes hard to do. You think that all these ideas and words seem to be so important, and sometimes they're just not that important, and it's more important to drop them and make sure the really important stuff stands out. Hard thing to learn. Okay, so this is a little bit less hard to do, I think, and that is to make sure that the less important stuff is earlier in the sentence, that is shifted to the left. The data are offered to establish the existence of ESP do not make believers of us for the most part. Okay, so the most part is kind of highlighted here, I think. Even I just got to scan this in, and I was too lazy to retype it. And you can see that that's not quite really important. So here, you could probably just delete that, but we may want to have that qualifier in there somehow. And so the trick here is just to get it earlier in the sentence. For the most part, the data that are offered to establish the existence of ESP do not make us believers. So pretty simple way of solving that problem. Here's another example, and here's an example that not only is the less important information at the end, where it should not be, but it also creates a kind of a difficulty in understanding what it really means. So no one can explain why that first evil superatom exploded and therefore created the universe in a few words. Okay, so the few words, obviously is the less important of what's happening, and creating the universe is kind of important, I think. But the other problem that's created that this sentence have is the few words referring to the universe? No, it's probably explaining something. It's probably about something about the explanation, right? So by moving it earlier in the sentence to the left, we solve two problems. Perhaps the most important problem is that we get the most important information at the end of the sentence. And the second problem is it gets that in a few words closer to what it really refers to. And it doesn't leave any ambiguity about are the words about creating the universe, or is the words about the explanation? Well, clearly the words are about the explanation. So let's get that closer to what we really mean. So generally the rule is, or the suggestion or the guidance here is to shift the less important information to the left. Now, and here's another, kind of, I guess another way of saying the same thing, in some ways, depends on how you want to look at it. And that is you just move the important stuff to the right. And we'll use an example for what we're talking about. Moving the important information to the end of the sentence is another way to manage the flow of ideas. Well, here's the new stuff, right? And so here's the more important stuff. So we want that at the end, rather than what we've been talking about already. We've been talking about how to manage the flow of ideas. And so another way to manage the flow of ideas is to move the important information to the end of the sentence. So you can see that we've switched the order around completely of this sentence here, and now we have the more important new stuff at the end of the sentence. Okay, here's another example. Those questions related to the ideal system for providing instruction in home computers are just as confused. Okay, so we don't know what's up here and we don't know what follows, but just kind of implies that we've already talked about confusing things. So this isn't the new stuff. It's something to do with the providing instructions, right? So let's move the I think about this as moving the just as confused earlier in the sentence. Just as confused are those questions related to the ideal system. So that's a better way to go, and it may allow you to more easily transition to the next sentence. So it would be hard to go just as confused and then talk about for example. That would be a kind of a jarring transition, or not much of a transition at all. Whereas if we have this sentence, just as confused are those questions related to ideal systems providing instruction in home computers. For example, should the instruction be... So I think it lends itself to a much easier transition into the next sentence of the paragraph. Okay, here's another example. I think our last one. The discovery that will change the course of world history and the very foundations of our understanding of ourselves and our place in the scheme of things is imminent. Okay, there's actually two problems with this sentence, and we're going to solve it by changing, the focus of this whole, lecture. That is getting the new information at the end, and that is intimate. I don't think that's the most important part. It's this whole thing about very foundations of our understanding of ourselves and so on. That's the thing that we want at the end. And so here's a pretty simple change. A discovery is intimate that will change, and so on. So now notice that it does put the most important stuff at the end, but also solves another problem I see with this sentence, and that is the distance between the noun, a discovery, and the verb is intimate. Right? We have this long clause in between, and that makes it a little bit of a mouthful to kind of swallow, and for the reader to digest as they are going through the paragraph. Whereas this, we have discovery is intimate. So right there, we have the subject and the verb. They can't get any closer than that. And then we have this clause that we can more now easily digest, and it's in its proper place in the sentence. So the change really solves both problems with moving the is intimate earlier into the sentence. And that's often the case is where we solve one problem, we solve other problems with the sentence and lead it to a better sentence and often a better paragraph. Okay, so before we get into our last topic and that about getting ideas to flow, I want to bring up this idea that Pinker calls the curse of knowledge, um, and it's related to this idea of getting ideas to flow. It's related also to making sure that ideas are in the right places in the sentence and in the right place in the paragraphs. And the curse of knowledge is basically when you don't understand why someone else is not understanding what you're writing about. And the problem is that you know the topic and the reader does not know the topic, and so you don't know what that reader, um, uh, if you're under this curse, what that reader is facing and trying to understand what you're writing about. And your reaction is, well, isn't it obvious what I'm trying to say? Um, don't you see what I'm trying to write about here? And Pickner uses this cartoon of this cop, perhaps on New York, giving directions to someone. And I was thinking, well, this is kind of a antiquated, out-of-date cartoon because now we have cell phones and we can just look at Google Maps or whatever to get directions, so we don't ask anyone anymore, right? But I'm sure you've had experience where someone you have to ask directions, perhaps even to where a room is in a building, where Google Maps is not going to be of much help. And one of the first things they often will say is, "Well, it's really easy, and you just do this." And of course, within 5 seconds, often you're completely confused. You're more like this pedestrian here, the tourist in New York, where it may be obvious to the cop and to the person giving you the directions about where the room is, but it's not nearly at all obvious to you. So that's the curse of knowledge. The person giving the directions knows and thinks it's very easy. The person receiving the directions, not so much. So that's something to keep in mind. Think about what put yourself in the reader's position and try and understand what he or she is going through in understanding what you're reading, what you're writing. So it basically uses the techniques that we've already talked about. You put the new information where the readers expect it, usually at the end of the sentences. And another trick here, and this is more for technical writing, is that you make sure you use these technical terms in the right place so that you can lead the reader through the paragraph. But that does not mean you repeat common words, and we've talked about this already. Words like reveal, show, and so on, which really are there's not much information in them, and so we should try to find other ways of other words, but often rephrasing the sentence so you don't have to use them at all. So I'm going to spend a little time on this paragraph, and I think it was from a student a couple of years ago now. If you go through it, I'm not going to try to go through it all. I would say that each of the sentences is okay, are okay. But overall, I found it kind of hard to read, even though I don't think the science is that hard to read if you understand a little bit about what nutrients are and algal blooms and what an estuary is. I think the science is not that hard, especially if you had the marine biology course. But it's hard to get through, and one of the hard things is let's start off right off the bat here. Here's kind of the curse of knowledge. Basically, the writer is kind of assuming that you basically know the really salient feature of an estuary, that is this mixing of fresh water and salt water. And if you kind of have a vague idea of that, it may not be really obvious why these seeps are called estuaries because of their localized freshwater input. I think this version makes it a bit more obvious why they may be called estuaries. So we've added a few words. Here's an example where we've added words so the sentence is longer, but I think this is a bit better sentence to start off with the paragraph with than this one, because it makes it more explicit what's going on as opposed to this sentence here. Okay, so the abiotic factors associated with estuaries hold for groundwater seeps. This is the original. Groundwater discharge decreases salinity and contains nutrients such as organic nitrogen and phosphorus from runoff. Okay, so each of the sentences is okay, but I think it's kind of hard to read because you're going from this thought, and it's not really clear what are these abiotic factors um, uh, that apply to groundwater. Well, this one I think kind of makes that a bit more explicit. The abiotic factors associated with groundwater estuaries hold for groundwater seeps analogous to the salinity gradient of estuaries. The freshwater seeps contain nutrients, and so on. So notice we have this phrase that helps to guide the reader into the next thought about what's happening in these groundwater seeps, and that they're mixing the nutrients. So it kind of, here it makes kind of implies that the decrease of salinity is correlating with these nutrients, and that's basically what happens. The river water comes in with very low. It doesn't have any salt, but lots of nutrients, and so you see the salinity increase as it mixes with the ocean water, and you see these nutrients decrease as they are mixed again with nutrient-poor ocean water. And so that's what's, I think, more explicitly outlined or mentioned here as opposed to here, which is just kind of hidden about what's going on. So again, cursive knowledge here, perhaps a little bit less so here. Okay, so it goes on. So here's the original. Groundwater discharge decreases salinity and contains nutrients. Prior production can utilize these nutrients, causing algal blooms. So here we have kind of analogous to what we saw with the bubonic plague pair of sentences. We have this new thought here saying it has the nutrients, that's great, but then it introduces still another new thought about prior production. And we're back to these, so we have the new thought here, A, and then we have another new thought, B, and then we're back to the nutrients, A, here, possibly causing algal blooms. So a better way to write this would be, so we're using the same change as I said before, and then rather than starting with algae use these nutrients, we say the nutrients are used by algae or prior production. So notice that we used a passive voice here, which remember is generally something you want to avoid. But here's where it's necessary, I think, where you want to use the passive voice because it gives a better connection between what's happening with the nutrients. Here's the nutrients here, and then the nutrients, what are they doing? Well, they're going on to be used by the algae. Here we have, here are the nutrients. Oh, then it's a prime production. Well, where's that coming from? Oh, they're using the nutrients. So we have to think a little bit more about this version as opposed to the second version here. And so here's where I've diagrammed it out for you. Probably doesn't really appeal to you as much as to the scientists and me. But anyway, here goes. So here it decreases salinity and contains nutrients. And so we have this going from A to B, and then still another new idea that is about prime production, going back to the nutrients B. Versus here, we have groundwater contains nutrients, A to B, B again being the nutrients, and then we start off again with the nutrients, going on to this new idea about the algae, or we could have said prime production, leading to algal blooms. And so here's the whole complete revised paragraph to get rid of some of these problems. And the rest of the paragraph has other examples of this. So I hope you'll go through this and try to learn from it to see how to get ideas to flow. Using these ideas about putting the most important things at the end, putting the new things at the end, and leading the reader through the chain of thought. And making it explicit. Don't try to get out of the cursive knowledge and put yourself in the reader's position and trying to understand what's going on. While at the same time remembering the tone that you're trying to set. You're not talking down to the reader. You don't have to explain, for example, what abiotic means in this case. So you have to remember that it's a scientific audience, but at the same time you have to make your reasoning explicit and clear. Yeah, that's sometimes hard, but that's the challenge of writing this type of material. And I think that's it. So we'll end there, and hope that you'll be able to apply these things to your